Well, first of all, we need to end the war, and unfortunately we are far from it. I think it's very important that those that are the key stakeholders in this conflict, the countries that have been supporting either the government or the opposition, be it Russia or the United States, be it Saudi Arabia or Iran or Turkey. I think it's very important that these countries understand that now this is a war that nobody is winning, that everybody is losing. It became a threat to regional stability, a threat to global peace and security. And I would like to see these countries come together, overcome their difficulties, and make sure that peace is reestablished. And that is the first condition, and the most important thing, because if not, this can last forever. This can be a protracted war, and the more the war lasts, the more difficult it will be to reestablish confidence among the communities. And this is something that really, I'm very sorry for the Syrian people. I've been in Syria many times because of the Iraqi refugees in the past, and we could see Alawites, Sunnis, Christians of different groups, Druze, Kurds, and they would live, apparently at least, in perfect harmony. There was a political problems, but not community problems. And now to see these people divided in sectarian lines is terrible. So I think that what is needed is first, during the war, and especially with those that the refugees abroad, to try to keep the links between the different communities, to try to avoid that this sectarian divide replicates itself in the diaspora, in the refugee communities of Syria, to make that the Syrians outside at least are able to maintain what was a traditional tolerance among communities. And second, to bring the religious leaders and other elements of the society to play a positive role since now. And then, if one day we manage to end the war, to do everything possible to re-establish the fabrics of that society, bringing the communities together and making them understand that indeed there are no reasons for this divide, because this divide was created by politicians. These the intercommunal problems have been artificially created by those that had political objectives in Syria, as it happens, by the way, in many other situations around the world. But it will be a difficult effort, and I must say, I'm not sure if it will be successful. Unfortunately, we are seeing in other parts of the world that once these demons are released, it's very difficult to tame them. Well, I think that the understanding that diversity is a richness, it's not a threat. That the fact that we have others that are different from us, but that can live and work together with us, is something that enriches us. This deep belief is the essential element that allows for plural societies to exist and to succeed. And this was clearly understood in Syria before. So what we need is to reestablish this pluralist approach to a society. And that needs, as I said, to be done since now, wherever we can do it, but to make people understand in Syria and around Syria that value is essential. Unfortunately, we are seeing, look at Iraq, again, how these divides are being exploited by the political leaders to serve their purposes. But at the same time, if you look at Lebanon, it's a miracle that the Lebanese society, they learned the lessons of the civil war, and they are managing to keep a very precarious equilibrium, but they are keeping it. So my hope is that in Syria people will understand that after all this tragedy, it will be better to re-establish what was the basis of the Syrian society before, and that was clearly pluralism. Well, unfortunately, the international community has shown very little capacity to prevent crisis. There are several reasons for that. First, I lived the unipolar world when the US were the hegemonic power, and before that, the Civil War, the bipolar world. There was not a global governance system, but there were clear power relations. Today, we have not a unipolar, not a bipolar, but not yet also a multipolar. We have a kind of a chaotic world, and power relations are not clear. And the Security Council is paralyzed in relation to everything that is important. Regional organizations are weak. We see it even with the European Union. And so the capacity to intervene timely, to prevent conflicts, has proven to be weaker than what would be desirable. At the same time, there are root causes of conflict. I mean, either economic development, poverty questions, or intercommunal difficulties. And again, in relation to that, the world has shown very limited capacity to act. And Central African Republic is a clear case. We saw it coming, and we did nothing as international community to avoid it. And it's not only Central African Republic. The same happened in South Sudan. Look at Nigeria. Where is the prevention capacity of the international community now active in Nigeria to avoid the worst? So we see things coming, but we do very little to address them. And this is something I would like to see the international community really being able to address root causes and to engage more actively diplomatically in solving the problem. In the case of Central African Republic, the fact that it's a remote place, that nobody hears about it, the media are not there, has helped this neglect. And on the other hand, as you rightly said, there was never a religious conflict there. But it's true that with the Seleka coup, the Seleka had not an Islamic agenda, but they were mostly Muslims. And of course, when they came to Bangui, their salaries were not paid, so they start looting. And as most of the population in Bangui is Christian, of course, this gave the impression of an interreligious question. And then the politicians used it, namely the former president, used it. And a new monster started to emerge, the so-called anti-Balaka, sometimes calling themselves a Christian militia, but no, it's a group of gangsters. Again, some link to previous militias, some link to the former army, some link to the former president. I think the international community made there a mistake in the evaluation of the situation. They concentrated on the disarmament of the Seleka, and they did not notice that that monster was emerging. And when they noticed it, it was too late. And the monster was able to promote what was a terrible religious and an ethnic cleansing, namely of the Muslim community in the western part of the country. In the last few days, we had first one church, then one mosque destroyed by rival groups. And so in a country that never had a religious problem, that was created artificially by those seeking power or seeking the pursuit of criminal activities. And today it will be difficult to reestablish the old equilibrium of Central African Republic. And what we are witnessing now is total chaos and banditism. And again, the international forces there I would say essentially unable to create the minimum of law and order, and the state has disappeared, so there are no institutions to guarantee that criminals are arrested, go on trial, and if condemned, are put on jail. Nothing happens. There is total impunity, and this is a tragic situation that will take a lot of time to revive. And once again, as in Syria, religion is used and by others that have political objectives, and a demon is created artificially, but then it is released and it's very difficult to tame. And this should be a lesson. for those that play with these things. And this is also true in the developed world. We see the recent European elections, how populist politicians, irresponsible media play with fears, play with this kind of feelings and trigger artificial divisions, invoke false identities, create divisions in societies where those divisions did not exist, and benefiting from the fact that sometimes mainstream parties are afraid to tell the truth and to intervene actively, fighting against these trends. They undermine the tolerance even in the developed societies. I think we should look into the Central African Republicans of this world and understand how important it is everywhere to make tolerance prevail, how important it is everywhere to understand diversity is a richness, how important it is to understand that all societies will become inevitably plural societies, but that is not a problem. That is a positive thing. Well, we have been talking about Europe. I think it's important to recognize that these populist trends, these false or artificial forms of nationalism, these demonstrations of irrationality are still limited in the context of the European society. They are still a problem of minorities. And what, in my opinion, has lacked is a clear determination of those mainstream forces in society to fight it. I remember when I came to government in my country, Portugal was becoming an immigration country. We had been an emigration country for centuries. We are back as an emigration country with the present crisis. But at that moment, we had an immigration crisis. And this was something that was neglected. I mean, nobody was really dealing with it. So we decided, first of all, to legalize the migrants. And we legalized about 400,000 people, which means 4% of the population. So it's meaningful. And to tell the truth to the people. I mean, look, we have a fertility index of 1.3, which means the Portuguese society is not sustainable. So migration is something we need for our economy. And the truth is that telling the truth to the people, making the people understand that migration was part of the solution of our problems, not a problem to our society. The interesting thing is that in the Portuguese society, migration never became a political problem. I mean, the last elections, with an economic crisis, with high levels of unemployment, we could expect this thing to be. It was not. No party raised it because the mainstream parties have assumed the truth and have been very clear when some extremists tried to raise the issue, fighting them and explaining and telling the truth to the people. Now, in some societies, what we see is some parties almost afraid of raising these issues and letting the propaganda of the more extreme groups prevail. And of course, with the media, that, I mean, many people in the media want to sell, and what is sensational is what sells. I mean, what is news is not when a dog bites a man, is when a man bites a dog. So obviously, for the media, these kind of things are sometimes interesting from the point of view of their market share. And so this combination of irresponsible media with populist politicians and with the lack of courage of mainstream political and social forces in the country to fight them has indeed generated in some European societies some worrying dimensions. Xenophobia, racism, Islamophobia. But I still believe these are minority groups. I still believe that if the economic crisis is overcome, if people will feel there is a sense of insecurity in general because of unemployment, because of the globalization, all these things. If these things, if the European society is able to overcome these economic and social difficulties, I think the the tradition of Europe as a pluralist society and the values of the Enlightenment that were a very important contribution of Europe for the world civilization, tolerance, la primauté de la raison, the irrationality not being accepted as a form to address problems, I think this in the end will prevail. That is exactly the problem. It's the unpredictability of the present state of affairs in the world. I don't know. It could be Nigeria, but it could be in Central Asia. It could be anywhere. And what I see is that the international community is not doing everything possible to detect, to have early warning mechanisms, to detect what problems might emerge and to be able to address those problems before explosions take place. So what I'm worried about is exactly this lack of capacity of the international community to know where the new crisis can emerge and to address it before it's too late. Well, if you go to a camp like Dadaab, you have 430,000 people living in a city that is now the fourth city in Kenya, but they have no right to work. They live artificially, totally dependent on humanitarian aid, and it has been so for 20 years. So this is not something that is acceptable. I mean, we need to try to do everything we can to create the conditions for people to be able to be self-reliant, to have a life as normal as possible. Now, I understand that for many countries that are not rich countries, that have huge rates of unemployment for their own societies, in which there are land property problems or land ownership or access to land problems. I mean, it's very difficult to accept that all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of refugees come and that they enjoy all the rights of their own population that is not even able to enjoy them in practical terms. And so international solidarity is absolutely essential. Massive support to refugee hosting countries should be established, but also to allow for those countries to grant refugees the conditions for a normal life that unfortunately in many situations do not exist. We are making progress. There is the now out-of-camp policy in Ethiopia, and for instance you have young refugees going to the university in Ethiopia. It's a very positive step. We have recently established a program in Eastern Sudan for Eritreans. So I mean there is progress being made. We had the integration of Burundians of 73 in the Tanzania society. There are elements of progress being made, but there is still a large number of refugees that are condemned to live in camps in a totally artificial life. And this is something we should be able to overcome, but it will not be possible to do so without massive international solidarity, and that international solidarity is not always there. It's very difficult, and in many situations, as I said, we are forced to keep artificial situations for decades, allowing people to live, but not to enjoy all the rights that correspond to a normal life. In some situations, and especially where international solidarity becomes stronger and countries understand that they will have international support to do it, it has been possible to integrate refugees in their host societies. But we are talking of usually of very poor people in very difficult circumstances. And so it's easy to recognize that governments are sometimes afraid to facilitate an integration for which they believe their countries have no conditions. Well, I think that the most important thing is to convince governments and countries that refugees are not necessarily a burden. They can be an important instrument. Einstein was a refugee. Many important people in science, in politics, namely in countries like Canada or the United States or Australia that are countries of recent emergence in the world, many relevant people in those countries were refugees. Well, the US was built starting by refugees. So to make people understand that refugees are not a burden, to accept refugees is not something we do because we are forced to do, but I mean, it's a problem. But that they can indeed be an element of diversity and richness in societies, and they can contribute to the development of societies is, I think, the most important thing to do. And we are making an enormous effort to make people understand this. And I think that in many situations we are being successful. And especially when we are able to tell the success stories, when we are able to show those that were refugees and became important elements in a society with important contributions to the countries where they live, that is the best argument we can have to convince governments and to convince public opinions that to receive refugees and to grant protection to refugees, to integrate refugees, is an element that is part of the natural development of any modern society. I think Canada has a very successful policy of integration of refugees, especially of resettled refugees. Canada is one of the 3 countries, US, Canada and Australia, that have large resettlement programs with people coming from all over the world into the Canadian society. And thanks to the excellent cooperation between central government, regional and local government and the civil society, with a key role played by the civil society, and also thanks to the multicultural nature of the Canadian society. The truth is that those refugees that came to Canada are one of the very few group of refugees that have a more successful integration in their countries of settlement. And it's not only refugees. I'll give you the example of the Portuguese migration. When I was in government, we did a survey about how our migrant communities were living, their problems, their interests, how the government could support them. And in one of the questions of the survey, there was our interest in trying to perceive how they were seeing their countries, the countries where they were living. And interesting thing is that of all Portuguese communities abroad, and we have communities everywhere, the one that had a better opinion about the country where they were living was our community in Canada. Now, this proves, and if the Portuguese were feeling that, refugees coming from all over the world will feel the same. This proves that this is a particularly welcoming society, and that, of course, makes the Canada Resettlement Program a very important tool we have for refugee protection in the world.